English style is most interesting when it is evolving. It owes perhaps its greatest transformation to Nancy Lancaster and John Fowler, who succeeded in bringing an extraordinary freshness and clarity to a look that was, in their time, overburdened with past formality. More recently, I've been interested in the work of those who have taken a pared back approach in order to create a look that combines the elegant feel of classic English houses with a more contemporary take on the practicalities of daily life. Some of the best examples of this style are the interiors conjured up by Emma Sims-Hilditch, who has been unwavering in her focus on employing classic good looks, comfort and functionality to create outstanding homes. Welcome back to the Country House podcast, and welcome to our viewers on YouTube who are joining us for this, our first proper podcast episode. And most importantly, welcome to Emma here, lovely Emma Sims-Hilditch, our guest on today's episode.
Thank you, Geoff. Thanks very much for having me.
Emma, thank you for joining us.
Welcome to our home.
Thank you. And Rory is joining us remotely, as your viewers can see.
Hello.
But I am in this lovely home in Wiltshire, down sort of between Salisbury and...
We're sort of just north of Bath.
Near Bath, really, yeah.
Bath is the closest town, a very historic city, as everyone will know, full of wonderful Georgian architecture, which is definitely one of my favourite periods in the history of architecture. So, yeah, we're very lucky to have that on the doorstep.
Just for our listeners who haven't gone onto the YouTube and listening on the audio, and speaking of Bath, the scene in front of me is very beautiful, everyone. Oh God, a car alarm's just gone off. I hope that's not too loud. It's very, very beautiful. You've got this amazing Cotswold stone, well, it looks like Cotswold stone fireplace. It's beautiful, sort of Renaissance style thing, and a lovely bare stone wall, and then a kind of whitewashed wall next to it. It's very clean. It's very fresh. It's a lovely backdrop for both of you, I have to say.
It actually feels like I'm in the Mediterranean. It feels like I'm in Provence or Italy, and I think that's sort of what you've gone for, Emma, isn't it?
Very much so, yeah. John, my husband, and I spent a lot of time, sort of 20 years ago, traveling through Europe, and I have to say that's where so much of our inspiration and the DNA of what you see today of Sims-Hilditch came from, was the travel through particularly Provence and then sort of Tuscany and those gorgeous stone farmhouses. And actually what's so interesting is the stone in Provence and in Tuscany is very, very similar to the Cotswolds.
Oh, interesting.
So the colour and
it's it's a sandstone, isn't it?
It is, and it's just a warm colour. As you go further north in the Cotswolds, you get this very orange stone, whereas here I feel it's more Provence.
Yeah, it's a lovely sort of light honey coloured, creamy colour, isn't it? Yeah. Well, before we run ahead of ourselves, let's start, Emma, with at the beginning.
Yes.
So really, for our listeners and our viewers, the extract I read at the start of this episode is from the beginning with a foreword by Kit Kemp to Emma's book, The Evolution of Home, which is the title or the subject of today's podcast. We're going to be talking with Emma, who's an interior designer, about what makes a house a home, how home has evolved over the centuries, over the decades, over the years, the role of home, that sort of thing, and also how to make a house a home, which is what Emma does for a job, I suppose.
Very lucky to.
So, Emma, why don't we start by just asking, can you give us a bit of an intro to who you are, what you do, what your background is? That'd be lovely.
Of course. So I am married with 3 kids, all grown up now. I was born and bred in the countryside in Sussex, in a wonderful 500-year-old thatched cottage. That was where I grew up. It had a priest hole in the ceiling.
Oh, wow, how extraordinary.
It was really historic, lots of old beams. But my mum was an incredible amateur decorator.
Okay.
So it was a bit like The Good Life when I grew up. It was a bit like Tom and...
Margot.
No, not Margot.
Not Margot. Tom, the Felicity Kendall character.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Begins with a B. I can't remember her name now. Anyway.
Bridget?
No, we'll remember.
Yeah.
But Tom was my dad.
Okay.
So Tom basically was a vegetable grower. They wanted everything to be organic. I mean, they were actually before their time. They did this wonderful sort of spinning, weaving, knitting. And I grew up with this incredibly creative family. And this was their kind of 70s period, I would call it, when I was in, like 10 or 11. And I went with my dad to beekeeping lessons, and my mum would take me to spinning classes. So, we were literally living this good life. She decorated the house in a very 70s way then. So we had sort of brown swirly carpets and green curtains and a brown Formica kitchen
Wow.
in this 500-year-old cottage.
Mhm.
And then the 80s came along, and it was so interesting because her style completely changed into what we all know as the kind of Colfax and Fowler, Osborne and Little. And by that time, they'd moved on to a very beautiful Georgian house, and they'd sort of grown up. And with that came this lovely aesthetic, which I guess was my kind of more influenced style of antiques, beautiful art, and a kind of grown-up country house feel. So yeah, I was lucky to have that as an upbringing.
And at what point did you? Well, I love the story of your husband and yourself starting your husband's company with selling hammocks to Harrods. Is that right?
Exactly.
Tell us about that, because that led to you then setting up Sims-Hilditch, didn't it?
Yes, exactly. So we got married. So I met my husband, and he was in the army at the time. But actually, he really wanted to leave, and we wanted to set up our own home down here in the Cotswolds. So we moved to Wiltshire. We bought this Cotswold cottage. It was 2 cottages and a barn attached, totally derelict. And the whole family were like, "What on earth are you doing? You know, you have no idea how much this is going to cost. You don't know what you're doing." We employed a fantastic local architect, Mark Watson, who Watson, Bertram and Fell, a very good quality practice. And anyway, we started this project, and alongside that, we started my business on the kitchen table. So I had been in the film industry working with Ridley Scott in the commercials world in London, in Soho. John had been in the army, came down here. I needed a new career, and I always had the passion for interiors. So I thought, I'm going to just go and learn to be a curtain maker. So that's how I started out. I learned to make beautiful curtains. I was obviously creative anyway, so I had this kind of sewing background. So I could make curtains on the kitchen table, and at the same time, John and his business partner Giles were trying to figure out what to do. And Giles said, "Well, I sold Mexican hammocks at Reading University." And John was like, "Well, the Navy hammocks that we used to have, the canvas hammocks in the army were much nicer. Let's do something like that." So I sewed the first hammock here in the schoolhouse where we live today. We've always lived in the same house. And the journey began. And yeah, it really was quite a roller coaster in the early days.
And you were just flogging hammocks. You managed to get them into Harrods, and from there it skyrocketed. And then
that's right.
And it was by that point it was already called Neptune. The company.
Yeah, so the company was always Neptune. So John's company was always called Neptune. They loved the sea, and they loved, both John and Giles loved sailing. So that's where the history of that name came from.
And there is, for our listeners and viewers, there is a slight nautical theme throughout the house as well, isn't there? There's little hints of boats and seaside.
Yes, exactly. So great sailors. So yeah, so the Neptune business was running alongside mine, and we were kind of doing our own thing at that stage. And then as the business of Neptune, suffered seasonality, problems with trying to sell garden furniture in the rain, in the pouring rain and freezing cold didn't work. So they started to sort of be interested in the interior market. And I then pricked up my ears and said, well, in my projects, I know the type of thing we need.
So were you by this point already doing full interiors?
Yes.
Or were you doing just the curtain making? No,
I'd started to move into, I had one lucky break, which was a wonderful young couple who had bought a big house. They didn't really know where to begin with it. And they took me under their wing really and said, look, we want you to do this house for us. We trust you. We love what we see in your own home. Just do the same for us. And that was my lucky break. And then from there, the business grew.
And the business is called Sims-Hilditch, which is your surname, and then your husband's business is Neptune.
Yes.
That's really cool. And it's just and both your businesses have seen great success in recent years, haven't they?
Yeah, I mean it's been a wonderful creative journey. Running a business. I did a business studies course when I left school, so I didn't actually do an art school training. I went and did business, and I think that was such a great foundation, having that the film industry where it was very meticulous. It was all about on time, on budget. And let's face it, a good, an interior project is not just about creativity.
No. And you're right. And too often you get one or the other. You get someone who's all budget and no taste, and all taste and no financial awareness. And actually it's important to have both.
It is, and that's what we do.
That's really good. Now, I want to just touch on a little bit more in terms of family, because we've talked about your lovely husband, your
Yes.
own creative upbringing with your
Yes.
mother, but we haven't talked about the fact that you are, in fact, the matriarch of your own creative family, because the way I know you, Emma, is through your lovely children.
Exactly. Great
And we're
friends with
surrounded by beautiful
family.
paintings by your two
Daisy,
daughters.
yeah, Daisy and Betty. So 2 daughters in their early 30s, both of whom are artists in their own right. Daisy is a classical artist. I describe painting in the very traditional form using oils, both landscape and portrait.
And she's currently in Florence.
She's currently in Florence, gone back to the Florence Academy to do a year there on just pure drawing and life. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Sort of technical skills.
She does the most extraordinary portraits. Beautiful. She's trained originally at Charles Cecil,
Exactly.
which is an atelier in Florence for our listeners, it's actually in the, I suppose, I don't know what the word is, sort of the bloodline of Sargent, because
Yes.
Charles Cecil, who started the atelier, he was trained by someone who I think was trained by John Singer Sargent,
Exactly.
the great sort of Edwardian portraitist.
Yeah, American, Bostonian.
Yeah, exactly. So we see the sort of lineage traveling through to Daisy herself, who paints in the same style and way as Sargent, size portraiture. And so she's brilliant. And she also does these wonderful plein air landscapes, which are very popular
all over the Europe. She travels. She does the mountains and the seascapes. Venice, Italy is obviously a love for her, and I think you can see that in her work.
And we're gonna talk a bit more in a minute about how paintings and art are part of what makes a house a home. I think at this point we want to just talk about that differentiation. So this is the Country House podcast. Rory and I are country house historians, or in my case, an amateur one, but we muddle along. Can you explain to us, Emma, the difference between a house and a home, and what makes a house a home?
I love that question. I think, for me, when you see a house for sale on Rightmove or one of the estate agents, portals, and you look at it and it's for sale, and you look at that house and it's sort of slightly sad looking, slightly empty, the difference between some houses and others photographically or when you walk into them is so significant. And often that is just the things that have been collected over the years. It's the layers that you add to a house that actually make it into a home. It's the personalization of that building. A house is just bricks and mortar at the end of the day, isn't it? I mean, even this house that we're in now, if it wasn't for the years of sort of curation that I've done here and collected things and things that I love personally, whether it's from my travels through Europe or going to Battersea Antiques Fair or picking up a lovely painting and hanging that, it's those things that make it personal. So I do believe, it's that really. It's also a feeling, isn't it? A home is about the senses. Yeah. And what you smell. Like you walked in here and said, "Oh my God, Emma, your house smells gorgeous."
Well, Emma has these wonderful diffusers from Florence, and I thought that it might be from Florence, and they're the most wonderful diffusers, and the whole house smells amazing.
Yeah,
you're right, Emma. And I suppose, Rory, I suppose you can probably jump in at this point. You've been to many houses that have been homes for many generations, many centuries. What do you find it is when you go to those houses that makes, some houses you might go and it feels like a museum, or it feels cold, not physically, but, spiritually or emotionally. What is it that makes you feel like a house is a home?
Thank you, Geoff. I'm a believer in the idea of sort of spaces that have a sticky or adhesive quality, places where memories get created. I don't know, but I'm sure you'll notice that if you go to a really beautifully designed house, old house, there are often bits that are people's favourites. And they'll go and sit there, or they'll go and read there, or they like to talk there, or whatever, whether it's a bay window or a little nook or a corner of a drawing room or something. And I love how people can create different memories of houses. And it sounds like an absurd thing to say, and it's not a very historical thing to say because it's not, grounded in fact. But I feel that those memories sort of linger, and I love talking to friends about houses that we've both been to at different times, and how people have different memories of them. And I think that for me, somehow that the ability for you to kind of inject part of your past into a house, into a space, somehow makes it stronger. Sorry, that wasn't expressed very well, but yeah.
And in a way that a house can mean so many different things to different people, and that's what it's extraordinary. The house is the same when you look at it. It looks the same to everyone, but that might be Billy's favorite chair, and that might be Daisy's favorite place to sit, and that's where Betty Learned to Crawl, and
Yes, exactly.
all these sort of memories.
For us, it's the kitchen table.
Yeah.
And I love
this
the
kitchen
fact
table here is the
this-
same one that
this
you've always
is-
had.
Yeah, we bought it when we first got married, so that's like 35 years ago. It's a pine table from a reclamation yard in Sussex, and for me, that's like the absolute essence of this kitchen that we're sitting in, or this kitchen barn sort of living space, is that kitchen table. It's had, it's had blood, sweat, and tears. It's had, all sorts
your children's birthday
of
cakes
parties, and
yeah,
so that's what
extraordinary.
makes
And it's
a real
probably where
home.
you originally spread out your plans to sell hammocks, and it's now where you do plans for.
It's where I sewed the first hammock.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's for me, is some pieces of furniture, as you said, Rory, are very special. So people always ask me, why do you have Swedish clocks? Because I love Swedish clocks, and we've got 2 or 3 of them actually, and I just love the character of a Swedish clock. And it's like they're female, they're not grandfathers, they're women apparently. They're called mortar clocks, and they were made in a town in Sweden, various sort of farms in Sweden, when in the midwinter, when the farmers couldn't go out because the soil was all obviously under 6 feet of snow. The farmers became carpenters, and these clocks had different personalities. The different villages that they were made in all had different personalities, and they're just like, it's like having sort of a grandmother in the kitchen.
Yeah,
the clocks.
They're lovely. They're very pretty.
I think there's a question I really love to ask you, Emma, based on what you were saying about your journey and the kind of nautical theme and all this sort of thing. We've spent a lot of time on the podcast talking about the country house style, the kind of Nancy Lancaster vibe, and obviously it's a famous thing and it's wonderful, and we love it here. But just taking a look, indeed, your website and at the room behind you, you have taken that and run with it. You've updated it and turned it into something a bit more contemporary. You've obviously added in these kind of Mediterranean notes, which wasn't so present in the kind of Lancaster vision. Can you talk to me a bit about that? I'm interested because people don't tend to associate English style with the Mediterranean. They're completely incompatible theoretically, and people also revere the Lancaster look and sometimes are afraid to update it. So just, can you talk to me about that process with you?
I think for me, it's about mixing different materials, different textures, different sort of palettes, and how I create my look is very much led with some pieces that are what you would expect to find in an English country house. So we always like to put some brown furniture in our design schemes. It is there's so many reasons why we should. It's wonderful to buy these pieces because they are beautifully made, not expensive. You can pick up a lovely chest of drawers or commode at auction, can't you, for £300?
Yeah, and a George III mahogany bureau for
exactly.
500 quid. It's extraordinary.
And so, but what's so lovely is they fit so beautifully with this sort of what I call the Belgian aesthetic almost, because Belgium was another country that we travelled a lot in when we were doing this.
Slightly monastic, isn't it?
It is. It's sort of pared back. So, our curtain fabrics here are from Libico, which is a Belgian mill that's been going for 100 years or more. And the weight of the linen and the texture is so special. But then we'll add in a Portuguese, antique pine table, or a Howard chair, which is a George Smith chair, which has been upholstered in a contemporary stripe. So we've got various things around the room here. And for me, it's that kind of mixing of materials. So the wood, the painted finish on furniture, and the color palette all being relatively calm, because I feel like you can add pops of color. So every year, the
kitchen island is a bit brighter, and everything else is more neutral. Yeah.
Every year we do a crazy thing. Well, because we have the Neptune paint range, we need to try out the paints. So every year when we launch a new paint, we tend to paint something in the house that color, and it usually is the entrance hall and the kitchen island, because they're quite easy to do.
And they match, do they?
And we picked those with that color and brought it through.
Oh, that's clever.
It's a sort of lovely citrus green.
And that ties in actually with a project I want to talk about that you've done, which is in this book. And so before we talk about that project, can you tell us what the book's about, firstly? Maybe how, what the book's about, and then how the homes that you worked in, some of them have evolved over time as houses and homes. Yeah. Maybe we could talk about that wonderful house that you did, the ancestral home, which again, Emma did a country house, I think it's up in the north of England. It's sort of Lancashire, Yorkshire borders. Been in the family for 500 years. And what's interesting in the pops of colour, I was just thinking, is you had quite a relatively neutral kitchen and then a bright green, so bright red bar stools.
Yes,
And
exactly. And
something else, bright green chairs.
Yes.
Yeah, and so there were these pops of colour and otherwise, well, very historic house. But so tell us, in the book, it features these houses.
Yeah, so the book, we worked with Giles Kime. So Giles obviously has written lots of wonderful interiors books, and I was delighted when he said he'd like to work with us on the book. And we took a journey of, I think there's 9 houses, and they're all very different. There's a beach house, there's this house, sort of a Cotswold barn, there's ancestral home in the north of England, and then there are some lovely country properties,
sort of arts and crafts house in Surrey, isn't there?
Exactly. And a couple of London projects, and I think what we
and a Bath project as well,
and
a
beautiful house, a Regency house in Grade 1 listed. So there's a huge variety of projects. What we wanted to cover in the book was how a lot of these historic homes have evolved over the years, and how houses and the way they're used today has changed so dramatically, and the requirements of our clients who live in these houses has changed. So, rather than having, for example, a kitchen which is right in the middle of the house, small, pokey, dark, which would have been probably where the staff would have cooked, and then you have a very formal large dining room and a drawing room that no one ever uses. We've sort of taken these houses and we've turned them on their head, and we've said, okay, blank canvas, how do these houses now want to function? We want that real sort of big kitchen, living, dining room experience where people don't want the formality they used to want. And then everybody now seems to want a fantastic boot room. It's those back of house.
It's funny, isn't it, that back in the day, Rory and I have talked about country houses in the past where they didn't put any money really into the downstairs or behind. You would literally, I think there was a house we talked about at one point where the wide oak floorboards stopped at the point where you opened the service door, and then there were just cheap pine or whatever it was floorboards behind, or offcuts. And so they really, and it's interesting that those very service spaces like the kitchen, like the boot room, are suddenly the most important rooms in the house, even for the grandest families.
They really are. And I think they really do bring a wonderful sort of heart of the home feeling. I love practicality. I really can't stand it when you walk in a front door of a house and they haven't thought about where you're going to hang your coat, or I just need to nip to the loo quickly, or all this, where am I putting the keys down?
How do you think that in itself shows the evolution of home in terms of that, and how long has that been? A 50-year period where suddenly a boot room is now one of the most fashionable things to have?
I think it's much more recent than that, probably. And I think it's with the, I guess, demise or the slowdown of people having staffed houses. These big houses are no longer staffed, that now people are actually doing all these domestic duties themselves. So they want a fantastic laundry room with sometimes up to 3 washing machines, dare I say, and 3 tumble dryers, because they've got a huge house and they're doing all the laundry. And that's extravagant. But actually laundry can be, those domestic chores can be a very pleasurable experience if the room is nice. So why not make that laundry room beautiful? Why not tile it with some really nice tiles and put a lovely worktop and have good lighting? Consider the paint colours. It's no different from a kitchen. It's another functional space for me to design.
Do you think, when you think about the purpose of country houses 200, 300 years ago, the likes of when that house that you worked on was originally built, they were built, I suppose, firstly, we've talked about the role of country houses in estates in terms of sort of a business centre for the broader estate, but also a place to host other grand families or the royal family when they're visiting. And so it was sort of a show home almost. Do you think now, what do you find with houses like this one that is featured in here? They balance still maintaining that history of it being having these staterooms that aren't homely, but also being a family home.
So when we took on this project, the house had originally been run by a staff of about 30 people, and then I guess it started to deplete after the First World War, when all the men went off to fight and sadly were killed, and then there was just not that kind of level of staffing anymore. But what we found when we got there was such a beautiful kind of raw, basically historic house that hadn't been touched for 100 years pretty much. And so you still had, on the top floor of the house, we had one staircase going up for the men's servants' quarters and another staircase for the ladies. And they weren't allowed to meet. And the decoration upstairs was sort of layers and layers when we started to peel it back, of all these wonderful little, wallpapers that were sort of very decorative and of the periods. So you could almost trace back the history of the decoration through our kind of excavation, I guess, of the house. But I think the way that our client took on this house was that he'd actually had it in the family for 500 years. And so he felt he was a custodian. He was a temporary custodian who had managed to create some money to do the project by selling some land to a local developer. And so he then had a pot of money that he could invest in the house. And it was the first time this house had had investment for probably 100 years.
And it was a complete overhaul.
It was
when
a
you
complete
brought in,
overhaul.
It was the whole house.
15,000 square feet. And we literally took, with the architect, who was amazing, he created a central atrium in the house.
Which is the most beautiful room.
Yeah, and that had that.
It's sort of double height, isn't it, with a
glass,
cupola?
yeah, exactly, a domed, and it just created a fantastic space where entertaining.
And was that within a courtyard, a central courtyard that was originally in the house? Or
was internal, but it was a rabbit warren of these service rooms. Okay. So it was like the pantry, the larder, the this, the that. They were all without internal windows, and they were all dark
and all knocked together.
And so so the architect managed to get permission to open the whole thing up. And then all the formal rooms run around the outside with the windows and the views.
So essentially you've got a central square room basically in the middle, and then lots of rooms around
it.
Okay, and they all open into either each other or into the central.
That's what's so wonderful. It kind of flowed so beautifully. And then we repurposed the kitchen from obviously what had been this in the central space into what was the billiard room. So a fantastic large Victorian wing had been built for playing billiards and having a big dining room. And we repurposed that for the kitchen. So that's what we do. We love to look at plans and figure out how we're going to re-engineer the house.
Speaking of that process, which I think is so important, and I'm always amazed by people who can do it. If I were to present you, Emma, let's say I lived in an absolutely mad house, totally bonkers, Victorian, Queen Anne, Georgian, all higgledy-piggledy, with a sort of billiard room on the third floor, and I mean, just mad. Made no sense. And I came to you and I sort of said, I want to rationalize this, and I want to, money's no object. I want to create a home that works in the 21st century. What kind of processes would you be going through to work out how to rationalize that house? I'm very interested in this because I didn't know much about it, but I know it's probably one of the most important things when it comes to creating a home. What things do you look at?
Well, first of all, and this is the most important part of our job, is to understand our client's life and how they're going to live, and take a really detailed brief and understand the family and, the usage, and are they formal or are they relaxed? Do they want a big formal dining room that can seat 16? Or actually, is that not what they want at all? They want a home cinema. So taking the brief is always the bit that I think you can rush past it and start designing a house and then realize, actually, no, we haven't really understood our client properly. So we take a really detailed brief. It's a big questionnaire. It involves all sorts of fun brainstorming and mind maps and things like this. Then we go into concept design, and that is very much looking at the floor plan and taking a kind of holistic view, helicopter view of the plans of the house, and start to sort of map out how the flow and the functionality is going to work. And it's always that balance of function and form for us. So, thinking about pathways through the house, thinking about practicalities of, if your kitchen's over there and your dining room's here, how are you going to get the food from one side of the house to the other?
Do you find, I've got a friend who lived in his house. He bought a big country house that needed a lot of work doing. And they started by living in the house for 2 years, despite the fact that it had avocado bathrooms and shag pile carpets.
Yeah.
Because they wanted to work out how the house felt and where they, there's perhaps a space where there ought to be a door, but there isn't, or there isn't a door, but there ought to be. And so they worked on the garden initially for those 2 years. And then, of course, it meant that when the house was done,
it's lovely.
The garden was bedded down. Do you think that's a good idea if you've got the time?
Definitely. I think the house can often tell you things when you're in it. It can give you clues. You can start to feel the light. You can see the atmosphere that a particular room has. So obviously, You know, I love the fact that this big house in the north of England, we created the morning room. We redid the morning room, and it was always the morning room, and that's because it was east facing.
And the sun in the morning.
Yeah, and I just love that, and I
Yeah.
love the practicality of thinking about the orientation of each room in the house and how the sun affects it. If we get sun in England, which is quite rare, how the light affects the building, I think is very important to consider.
Linking with that, I suppose, thinking across all your projects, you've talked about sort of how you go about the process. What would you say are some of the highlights of your career and some of the greatest challenges you faced in terms of making houses work and beautiful spaces?
I think the highlight of my career has been meeting amazing people, not just the clients, but actually working with some of the best architects, the specialists that you meet, the antiques dealers. It's just such a fabulous world that we work in. I'm sure, Geoff, you or both of you will agree, we're very, very lucky what we do. So for me, it's that kind of thing of, you know, meeting Toby Lawford on his stand at Battersea and talking about, you know, the beautiful decorative antiques that he's found, or having a site meeting and chatting to Francis. We were talking about Francis Terry earlier, weren't we? But, you know, meeting some of these architects who are so inspirational and just feeling a part of a team.
Or and I suppose you must meet also, you know, I imagine, because I think you now have a range of fabrics with Sims-Hilditch, or not?
We've talked about it a lot. We don't have a range yet. We did have a very early range when I first started out. I thought I was going to be a textile designer. And one of the many things I did was have a collection of fabrics. But that hasn't come back. No, we have a range of furniture with George Smith.
That's right.
And we are doing a beautiful range of upholstery with them. And we're just about to launch now. We're in a week's time, beginning of March, a new furniture collection, which is very exciting.
With George Smith. Great. What's it called?
It's the Emma collection, and each of the new pieces has I think we're calling after our children. So I think there's a Billy and a Betty.
How fun.
Quite sweet.
I love that.
But yeah, really beautifully.
We didn't mention, of course, that, you know,
Billy.
so obviously Daisy is this wonderful artist.
Yeah.
Betty is
a
an
set
artist
decorator.
and a set decorator. She works on some fantastic films.
Yes, she does.
She worked with Rebecca Murray as Rebecca, didn't she?
Yeah.
And then Billy is the latest of the startup creatives.
Yeah, he has a gentleman's clothing brand that he started called Simswear, and actually had a wonderful write-up, I think it was in The Guardian last week, by the fashion editor saying, my go-to jersey for everyday wear is the Simswear jumper.
You can buy a wonderful woolen jumper, and then if a yarn gets loose, you can take it back and they fix it for you, and it's very sustainable and all that, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's all made in the UK and in Scotland, I think. And he just has an eye for colour, which I love. So his creative skills.
So your entire family are creatives.
I think
which
so.
I love. No, it's fantastic.
Yeah,
it's fantastic. And you somehow managed to turn it into businesses, which is a rarity, because you often get creative families that can't.
I know. I think you're once an entrepreneur, always an entrepreneur. And I think the family, unfortunately, have had to live through both of us sort of, you know, grafting very hard on the kitchen table over the years, and they've seen it. And I think for them now, they all have that very independent streak and they want to do their own thing. And they've seen the benefits, they've seen the challenges, but they can understand that being a founder of your own business is quite special. You're in charge of your destiny, which is lovely.
And in terms of sort of thinking a bit more about your style, as Rory mentioned, it's sort of a fresh, contemporary, chic take on the country house style. One of the things you mentioned with the brown furniture is you're very good at placing sort of antique pieces alongside contemporary pieces, and you might have, you know, a portrait by Gainsborough alongside a contemporary portrait or whatever, however it works. In terms of creating, if we had a listener or a follower or someone interested who, I suppose, whatever house they have, they want to create a similar vibe of or style of curating a space that is both beautiful and functional and homely and a place to entertain in, and combines brown furniture with contemporary pieces and old paintings with new. What would your tips be for creating a space like that? Because that is what you're so clever at, is all of that in one space.
I think my first tip would be, don't try to do it all at once. Don't expect that you can just go out shopping one day and furnish a house. That is not going to happen. That's not going to be a success. I mean, I think buying things when you see them for me is like it's an emotional attraction to a piece of furniture. That's how I see it. So I will go around a fair, I'll go to an auction. Let's say I'm going to Battersea Antiques Fair. I'll go around and in my mind I'll have 2 or 3 projects I'm working on, and I won't expect to resolve everything, but I will know I'm looking for a lovely cabinet or a dresser for one house, and so actually you're buying things when you see them, and then they start to form the scheme. They're the beginning, and then off the back of that you can then sort of thread in new pieces and textures and fabrics and colors. Sometimes it's one fabric. It might be this beautiful Chelsea Textiles embroidered cushion that some of you will be able to see and some of you won't, but out of one fabric and this beautiful textile, you can create a palette of colors which you can then thread through the whole house. And that's a great tip for me. It's either do it with a textile, or if you've got a painting, take a painting, one of Daisy's or Ken Howard, or a lovely painting that you might have or you might own or you just admire, and look at the palette of that painting and see how the artist has created that wonderful tonal values, and how he's maybe chosen rusts and blues. If it's a seascape, how the light has created.
And then you'll carry that through the whole house.
And then take that through the house, And we often do get clients who come to us with a small or a large collection of art, and that will inform the decoration.
And so I suppose with this cushion, did you use this for the colour scheme? Or
I mean, this very much.
You've got the sort of Robert Adam-esque sort of the blues, the pinks, the greens.
Yes, you have. That's very true.
And those are the colours that sort of carry on through the house.
This is very much an 18th century textile. I mean, Mona Pelhagen, who runs Chelsea Textiles, was inspired by the V&A. For all her textiles come from originals that she's bought at auction, many of which are sort of, still in the V&A. And I think, textiles are something very special.
And it's lovely because these colours are very much the type that Daisy uses in her paintings, which we're surrounded by. So I see.
So I think advice would be choose a palette. So obviously don't try and buy everything at once. Choose a colour palette that you naturally are gravitated towards and that you love, whether that's inspired from an antique textile or a painting. And then do take time to look at lighting. I think lighting, we haven't actually talked about lighting.
No, tell us about lighting.
Super important. And lighting for me can transform a house. It can really make or break a basic kind of quite inexpensive interior. If you put great lighting in, it suddenly transforms it. Not just decorative lighting, but architectural lighting. I always love to think of the layers of light. So starting with the ceiling, you'll have some downlights perhaps. And I've worked with Sally Story over the years, who's very talented, from John Cullen Lighting. And she always taught me that don't put downlights in any formal space unless you really want to light something specific up. So whether it's a curtain treatment, a beautiful Venetian window, or just a round table where you've got a lovely bust or something on it, you can light that from the ceiling, but don't just pepper the ceiling with downlights. Even in a kitchen, you don't need to do that. They don't need to be in a grid. They should be just lighting independent.
I see that here where you've got 2 downlights directly above the kitchen table.
Yes.
And then another 2 above.
Yes, and then around the dresser.
And 2 lighting up the dresser, and those are angles to light up the dresser.
Yeah.
And it's not a perfect grid.
It's not a grid at all. And I would always avoid a grid because it looks like a developer home then. That's one of the things I've learned. The other thing, so once you've gone with the ceiling, then think about the wall lights and then the table lamps. Always put 5 sockets under your sofas and your armchairs so that you can light like this with a reading light.
So you start top and go down. So the temptation often is to buy the table lamps straight away because they're the easy ones, but actually they might not fit with the colour scheme, and you've got to.
I think lighting is a technical subject. So think about it technically and get advice if you need to on lighting, because it can really transform an interior.
That's really interesting.
I recently moved into a flat, and I have to say, I'm now, if the one that's behind me, I'm currently feeling incredibly self-conscious about the way I've gone around doing it up.
Don't worry, I'm sure it's beautiful.
No, it's great. You can be a lot to think about.
It's the thing we often see in houses, and I think this is something that we can bring as experienced interior designers, is how you create, possibly in a newly built house. So a lot of the projects we do are new houses. How do you create that wonderful feeling of history and in the architecture when you don't have anything? And for us, that's done through choosing our hard finishes palette right at the beginning. So we have our fantastic design library in our studio in the Cotswolds, and we have a wonderful array of stones, of timber floorings, of brick floorings. And what we do is we build up this sort of scheme of the hard finishes early on, so that it's not just an afterthought. Oh gosh, we've got to put in limestone. Let's just go down to the limestone supplier and choose a sea of limestone. All these sort of interior architectural elements need to be thought of early. Get in early.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Interesting. Okay. And I suppose, Rory, have you got any more specific questions before we sort of begin to draw to a close, or applications specifically to country houses?
Well, I think funny, not really about. Well, I suppose about country houses. I mean, do you remember we did that wonderful episode on Patrick Lufoma's house in Manny a few months ago? Are you familiar with that house?
No, I'm not. No.
Oh well, it's a wonderful sort of wonderful.
It actually, it's got this wonderful exposed stone and fireplaces like this. And I mean, it's he was. I'm sure you've come across Patrick Lufoma, the great gentleman explorer, but his house on the Peloponnese, just the most extraordinary rambling house overlooking the Mediterranean.
Wonderful. No,
it
was the place for salons and all sorts. But Rory, go on.
Well, I suppose I just wanted to ask a bit more about. I mean, sorry, just because the space behind you kind of so resonant of that Mediterranean feel. What do you think it is? What sort of elements do you think that one can lift from those beautiful Mediterranean houses and bring them to England and that work in England? Because I think that I've seen it a few times, and it's just the most wonderful thing. It really lifts an otherwise perhaps sort of like damp climate into something that makes it.
Yeah, but Rory's right, and also it's extraordinary because the view I've got this way is to a very English country kitchen with an Aga and an island with marble tops, and so you've got a very English country kitchen there, and then this extraordinary
French limestone fireplace, which we actually did get. We did get from France, I have to say.
And how and can you, as Rory said, you can really bring in the best of other countries' architecture and design?
I think one of the things I love, this picture you're conjuring up of the Peloponnese house, and I imagine it to be with wonderful sort of rustic lime plastered walls perhaps. And I think, for me, it's always about the curvature of a wall. So how different a house can look literally by the way that you junction a right angle. So in England, building a new house, they'll put the sort of metal sheets in the corner joints, and then you get a complete right angle 90-degree corner sharp. But if you didn't do that, and as we've done here in the barn, everything is soft around render, so it doesn't have that feeling of sharpness. Instantly it feels more relaxed, maybe more Mediterranean. And then I think it's things like putting a brick floor in a bathroom, a brick stone floor, or you often see that, don't you? It's the textures. It's bringing in those wonderful rustic textures.
But isn't it interesting that by bringing, it feels like I'm on holiday. You must feel like you're on holiday every day when you come into this room, and it's amazing that you can create that in your own home.
Yes.
Through putting a bit of thought and effort and time into thinking about how it works. But you can, if you have special memories of a chalet, you can, I'm sure, create a room that, with stone and wood that reminds you of a chalet, and therefore it brings back those happy memories, I suppose.
Very much so. And I think it's also, if you visit hotels, and we've got a lot of inspiration over the years and finding these really special, small, family-run hotels, the Found de Marie in the Alps and the Bastide de Marie, which we stayed in Provence a few times, which was run by the Sibouet family. And it was a series of historic barns in Provence where he was the builder, she was the decorator. And that was my inspiration early on. And it felt like a home. And it's almost like hotels can inspire homes and homes can inspire hotels.
And actually, Forward, which I started with, the introduction to this podcast episode, was written by Kit Kemp, who is a hotelier.
Exactly. And she's the master of, or the mistress of creating really interesting atmospheres.
Well, I think my sort of my follow-up question to that, which I suppose is also quite a good sort of summary question, is you're at the cutting edge of the country house look. Where do you think we can expect to see it going over the next decade or so?
Oh, that's a fun question. I think we're well and truly in love with as a sort of world of decorating now. We're well and truly in love with that kind of more relaxed, what I call farmhouse style. I think that's become the new, if you look at a lot of our influences in design come from America, come from the West Coast. You know, if you look at what's happening in California, I mean, I went to Los Angeles last year and I was bowled over by the design aesthetic that they managed to achieve. You actually very influenced again by Europe, but they do it so cleverly. And so this wonderful oak kitchens are back, you know, using natural materials, being very aware of everything that we have, which should have longevity, should be designed to last a lifetime. You know, the flat-fronted spray painted kitchen is just not popular anymore because you can't repaint it because it's spray lacquered. So everything we do, we think about should be here to last for 20, 30, 50 years. And I think that's where the new generation or the younger generation, in terms of the environment and caring about buying once, buying well. And I'm delighted to say this room we decorated 18 years ago, and I have literally hardly changed anything from these cushions.
It's wonderful. So, actually, Emma, it's really interesting you say that, because that, I suppose, ties in with, you know, an ongoing debate we've had on the podcast. We often talk about beauty and sustainability. If you build a beautiful Georgian terrace, it lasts for 300 years and therefore is much more sustainable than a street of Barratt homes that has a life expectancy of 45 years. The initial outlay, though, is a bit more.
Yeah.
And for a lot more, you know, it's the same with, I remember reading an article saying, you know, you can buy a suit from Marks and Spencer's and it will last you for 3 years. You could buy a suit from Savile Row for 10 times the price, but it will last you for a lifetime, and you keep taking it back and it gets mended and adjusted as you put on weight and lose weight and so forth. That initial outlay is a lot more. How can you convince people for whom perhaps it's hard to justify spending that money initially that it's worth it?
I just would use my wood burning stove, which you can't quite. Oh, yes, you can. You can see him there in the corner, the Yotel wood burner. When we first bought this house 35 years ago, we put in 2 wood burners initially, and then this one a bit later. But my parents had Yotels. My advice from them was buy Yotel if you can. Buy once, buy well. That will last you a lifetime, that Yotel. And honestly, it was the best purchase because we could have bought one which was half the price then, but the interior would have buckled, the door wouldn't have closed properly. That is as good as it was the day we bought it. So it's worth the investment. You know,
it's taking that long-term perspective, though, isn't it? And
it is.
Too often we live in a culture which is all about quick gratification.
Yeah.
And it's actually, I suppose, it's unusual because it's an anomaly in history that we think in those terms. Because I suppose historically people would think more long-term. They would plant seeds and trust that they will grow rather than just going to the supermarket and buying them ready grown.
Yes.
And so in the same way, I suppose we want everything now, and that's also actually links in with the country, with a house. If you buy a country house, you want to. You've talked already about how you work gradually. You start with the lighting and work down, but you will get clients who'll buy a barn conversion and will say, "I want it to look like your house now."
Yeah, and we can do that. You know, if they give us the keys and they give us the budget, we can achieve that. And that's the beauty of coming to a professional practice. That's the difference between trying to do it yourself, which might take 5 or 7 years, and actually saying, I need it now. I want it done quickly. I want to enjoy it now while my children are young.
But they pay the money for it.
But they have to pay, but they also need to use the professionals in that instance. That's why we're here.
Yeah.
That's why we do what we love.
That's really helpful. And I suppose just as we close, linking back to country houses, which is sort of the theme of our podcast, surprise.
Yeah.
Is there, actually, I'll just say one last thing. It's interesting you mentioned that we're drawing influence from America. It's funny, of course, we've talked in the past about how the country house look, which was pioneered by Nancy Lancaster, well, she, of course, was an American. And it seems the Americans are very good at sort of seeing what's good about European design, but then distilling it into something more beautiful, aren't they?
Absolutely brilliant. And funnily enough, John and I visited the whole East Coast. So we did Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, the whole of the sort of wonderful East Coast where you have these immaculate houses, these wooden shaled,
the sort of typical Hampton
style. And we were looking at some architectural imagery that John had taken because we went there 10 years ago, and the photo popped up, and there were 20 pictures that he'd taken of a timber framed house that he'd seen being constructed in Martha's Vineyard. And he just said, I want to build a house. I want to build another house because I just love the way they build. And the American style is very, very clever. I love it.
And in terms of coming back to historic country houses, whether it's English, whether it's a chateau in France or a Schloss in Germany or wherever, have you got a country house that, from an interior design perspective, inspires you particularly?
Do you mean a historic?
Yeah,
one?
or just
Or
one that
one
you
of
haven't
our
done.
projects?
No, one that you haven't done that has inspired you. If you walk into a Robert, say you walk into the hall at Newby and you see one, have you got a sort of?
I mean, we're very lucky to have Durham Park about
Oh,
5
yeah, of
minutes
course.
away. And funnily enough, we're doing the Wow House, which we were going to mention. We're doing a Wow House stand this year at the
Chelsea Design Centre.
Chelsea Design Centre.
So explain what Wow House is for our listeners.
Wow, it is wow. It's like a series of rooms that you can walk through, designed independently by different designers, and each designer takes their own theme, and you have a sort of 4 by 5 meter space. And
it's essentially a house, a 6-bedroom house with a living room and a cinema and whatever, and every room is designed by a different designer.
Yeah, and we've chosen to embrace what we love most, which is the back of house spaces. So we're doing a hall, a boot room, and a dog room.
Which was actually one space that you've chosen to split up, is that right?
Yes, exactly. So we've kind of compartmentalized it. And so we're nicknaming it the Bow Wow House. And we've taken inspiration from Durham Park, where they have the most wonderful Delft tiles in one of the rooms. And we're working with Marlborough Tiles, who are great friends of ours, who are based just up the road in Marlborough. And we've designed a new collection of tiles that we're launching at Wow House. Spring, summer, autumn and winter. A Delft tile influenced by the seasons and what we have in our design studio in the Cotswolds.
And those will be available
to buy as well. Yeah.
How wonderful.
So that's a nice thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. And for our listeners, Durham Park, we have featured on our Instagram quite recently, actually. A wonderful Baroque house, actually designed by William Tellman, the architect who did the famous facade of Chatsworth. And it's a beautiful house and an amazing collection of Dutch furniture and the Delft tiles. Interesting.
And if you
all I can say, Emma, is that if ever you need a wow flat to use as a canvas in London, please, this is about 4 by 5 meters.
Rory, get into the queue. I've already asked Emma for thoughts on my cottage in Devon.
We're getting in. Very good.
Very happy to give advice.
Well, Emma, thank you so much for doing this. It's been a lovely chance to see you and hear about what makes a house a home. So thank you for your time.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for inviting me on your wonderful podcast.
That's very kind. And thank you to our lovely listeners and viewers for joining us today. And please do join us again next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.